Okay, we begin. For those of you who were not here last week, we gave out binders. In case you or someone you know needs one, there are 4 right here. There are also 4 books available, Chumashim available, still left for purchase. And I wanted to mention, this is week 4 of the class. If you happen to know of anybody that's still interested in joining, they can feel free to join. Some people get a little turned off from joining a class in mid-stride, but this is the type of class where wherever you join, whenever you join, you will gain something. So in case you know of anyone, feel free to let them know. What was that? Got it. Did somebody say verse 3? No. We're actually still on verse 2. Top of page 3. That's about the only 3 that we're going to get to today. Now, I did mention last week that we were going to split into chavrusa pairs this week. However, I didn't change my mind. All of you changed my mind. And the reason why you changed my mind is actually I took a lot of pleasure last week. I had prepared some remarks to say, and I never got a word in edgewise because of the animated discussion that we had. And I wanted to congratulate all of those that participated in that discussion, including those few that came after class and had some pretty astute remarks. And I encourage all to not feel that every remark that you say is stupid. It's just shocking that everyone thinks that their remarks are stupid. Okay, they're not stupid. They're actually very intelligent. And even if you missed the boat totally, the fact that you attempted, we applaud. So I encourage all of you to attempt. At some point, if I feel that the discussion is just going endlessly in a circular fashion, I will put a stop to it. But as long as people are productive, involved, and engaged, that is the point. I feel that as a teacher, I am just a facilitator of learning. I'm not here to just lecture endlessly and tell you numerous insights, even though I probably could, and you would probably benefit from it on some level. But the greatest benefit of all is for everybody to be fully engaged in the process of learning. And as such, we jump into verse 2. The land was so vavo v'choshech al pnei sahom. I'm on page 3, top of the page. V'ruach Elohim mirachefes al pnei hamoyim. And the Spirit of God was hovering on the water. So we were wondering last week a number of questions. I will not repeat all the questions, but I will repeat a thought that we mentioned towards the end, and that is that there is an esnachta. Anybody remember what an esnachta is?
It looks like
a little fork, a little wishbone.
And it's a trope guide.
And it's a? Semicolon.
It's a trope guide.
A what?
Trope guide.
Oh, trup, right, yes. It is a cancellation mark, and it is either a semicolon or a comma. But either way, it breaks up the verse into 2 parts. We never really explored that fully. There were a number of questions that were just flying about, and we never really got back to it. 2 halves of this verse. The first half seems to be indicating one thing. The second half seems to be indicating something else. Can anybody suggest a transition point at the esnachta mark?
Could you repeat that word?
Sure. Can anybody point out a transition that's taking place in this verse, the transition point being the point of the esnachta in the verse? Perhaps? Yes?
The division of sense between the spiritual and the physical.
Okay, how so? Where do you see that?
Well, okay. Well, first of all, talks about the first part of the sentence talks about culture, which is a physical thing.
Okay.
Okay. And then we talk about the spirit of Elohim, which is spiritual.
Good. Excellent. Great point. Any other transition that's taking place in the verse? Yes? Okay, so we're assuming that water is the water that we know of, which is not necessarily true, perhaps.
Well, first it talks about the earth being in one state, and then it talks about Hashem doing something to change that.
Excellent. Well stated. Okay, and that's exactly the direction that we're going in today.
Well, it says darkness covered the surface of the abyss. I'm sorry, you have to come in. I thought darkness was everywhere. So
The who?
I thought there was darkness everywhere.
Darkness everywhere.
If there wasn't darkness, what was there besides the darkness?
Okay, so let's assume, so you're assuming that the word choshech over here is referring to the darkness that we are familiar with as the absence of light. I'm not saying you're right or wrong. We're just making assumptions.
Now, I wasn't thinking of darkness as being the absence of light. I was thinking of darkness as being black, dark, void, abyss, type thing.
Okay, 4 excellent words that happen to be found in this verse.
I think of darkness as also the essence of spirit.
Okay, good. Absence of spirit. So, whatever these 4 terms mean, they seem to be indicating something. So last week we discovered that perhaps what is being communicated by at least the beginning of the verse is that there is a state of chaos, disorder, confusion that existed in the world prior to creation. Boy, brain's fried already? Gosh. A state of chaos before creation? Question mark? Before creation there's nothing. So clearly there's a state of chaos after creation. Well, during. Clearly before what we thought was creation begins. Because the first 2 verses describe, verse number 1 describes creation in a more general way. Second verse seems to be describing something. And verse number 3, here we go. We got to verse number 3. Verse number 3 is, Vayomer Elokim Vayihar Vayihar. So if you ask a 3rd grader what happened on the first day of creation, they will answer, the first day of creation there was light. And that's it. So we have these 2 extraneous verses in the Torah. The first 2 verses are extraneous. They describe something that we can't necessarily understand. And if we're describing the first day of creation, then we just have this pasuk hanging in limbo. We're not really sure what to do with it. Yes?
Right.
I'll go with your lunch.
Rabbi, I was having lunch with someone today. We were discussing this very thing.
Wow.
This individual is...
Wow. 1 second. I just need to stand up for that. Okay.
This individual is said that he has seen a
light
image that actually does not begin in the beginning. Is that where is it? Or where are they?
That's what we're talking about.
And he did not remember where he had seen this, but there was one. The Hebrew was the same, but the English did not begin with in the beginning.
I'm sure there are hundreds of versions out there. I'm sure there are hundreds of versions out there. I'm not familiar with them. Sorry.
My question.
Yes.
You mentioned the word chaos.
Yes.
But in Hashem's plan, everything was, it wasn't in order. It was in order.
Okay.
We may not have seen it as an order. We may not read it as an order. But I believe, it's my own personal opinion, that there was an order. There was whatever the time was, whatever that element was. To us it was a day, it could have been a second, a minute second. But there wasn't. He did have a plan, obviously.
Good. Now the question is, what was it? Agreed.
I don't really know what I said.
Agreed. There must be a plan. We assume that an intelligent being, which we assume God is, and we have every reason to assume He is, or she is, or it is, or whatever it is, an intelligent being creates an intelligent world. And we look around the world that we know, and we see intelligence wherever we look. So clearly, whatever we're going to say, I will not dare say has to make sense, because make sense presumes that it has to make sense to us. But at least, if there is a verse in the Torah which was presented to man, and I think, Dottie, you presented this thought after class, that why are we so arrogant as to presume that we need to understand what this verse is saying? Which I thought, what was that? To presume that we are to understand what this verse is saying. And I think that's an excellent point. And I don't think it's arrogance, as long as we approach it with humility. But the fact that it's in front of us, and the fact that it was presented to man, bespeaks a certain expectation to at least attempt to understand. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. Agreed? Good.
Yeah, there's an interesting phrase in the beginning of verse 3, let there be light. To me, what that suggests is that light somehow or other was there, and it was released.
Okay, we'll get there in a couple of months, but in the meantime, verse 2.
But if that's true,
Yes?
which we don't know, but if that's true, that's a description of a black hole.
Okay. Now we're getting very far afield. Maybe even to an event horizon, perhaps.
Light, by definition, is trapped. And it's there, and God then could release it. It doesn't say light was created, it was let there be, in effect, light released.
Good.
From wherever it was.
I'm going to put your comment on hold, because it's just going to distract everybody.
I thought you had the answer, Rabbi.
It could be. I'm holding back the light. Yes.
But there are dimensions in this world that we don't know about yet. Quickie point, in Switzerland they're about to discover a new dimension with the experiments that are going on 300 so feet underground.
Particle accelerator.
And they're sure they're going to find things they don't understand and will help explain this whole thing.
Sure. So in the meantime, is there a way of understanding this on a level that we can relate to? That is my question. Yes. Okay, great. What is it? So I suggest to you the following. The first half of this verse describes a state of utter confusion, chaos, tohu vohu, choshech, and tehom, as much as they are translated and in as much as the commentators struggle to define these words really have no equal in the text from this point on, and therefore they're describing something that is simply indescribable.
Is the chaos done, or is the earth still in the process of creation?
Good question. So at this point, it seems that the earth is this amorphous mass of potential that has not been formed into anything yet. And it sounds like this is exactly what the verse is describing to us. That creation takes place, poof, in a moment, from absolute nothingness to everything in its potential form. That was verse 1. Verse 2, God created everything in its potential form, but in a mumbo jumbo. Who mentioned mumbo jumbo last week? Mumbo jumbo, right? Everything is just confused. And then, in verse 3, we seem to have the beginning of a organization.
Can this not also be related, man to man and parent to child? That, we can look at things or a child looks at things and it's like just makes no sense, totally chaotic, what is he thinking? And Hashem hovering, his spirit was sort of, the essence of Hashem was hovering, just as if a parent hovers over a child to teach that child to make sense of things for them. So maybe this is a precursor for
Excellent.
everything.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to head in that direction. The first half of the verse describes a state of chaos and confusion and disorder. Then there's an esnachta on the word. So, And then we have the last half, the second half of the verse, which is Ruach Elokim Merachefes Al Pnei Hamayim. So we have a transitional element, I suggest. Yes?
I was going to get a question for what was the transition. So I was going to ask if the transition is from a state of beingness, we're describing the dark abyss and such, to the spirit and hovering, where it seems like it's starting to move into an active phase.
Excellent. That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you for saying it. Great. So we go from a state of chaos and disorder to a moment where we're introduced to the presence of God. The presence of God in this context would therefore mean that God, as it were, is injecting His essence into the world and doing what? Not creating, but organizing. Because creation takes place, everything is in its potential form, and now we need to engage in organizing all this potential matter into its separate components. So you have God appearing on the scene, as it were. And I hate to use those words, but it seems as though the Torah is presenting us with that image, that imagery of chaos, and then the intelligent being swooping in to organize that chaos into what we know of as nature. Yes?
Well, however, God was introduced in the very first sentence.
What was that?
God was introduced in the first sentence.
Of course. That's why I hated to use that term, that God is swooping in, as it were, as though He wasn't around before. Clearly, it is God that creates the world, and clearly it is God that swoops in to organize the mess, as it were. Last week we left with a philosophical conundrum.
He created the mess.
He created the mess. Why would He bother creating it in a mess, only then to organize it? And I gave you a week to think about it. And I'm glad I reminded you about what you were supposed to think about. Yes?
I'm going to follow up on something that Charlotte said. But I'm going to use God like a sculptor. And a sculptor has some clay and has water. And he uses that to form something. But right now it's nothing. It's just clay and water. And then, so it's chaotic. It's not nothing. It's nothing.
Formless.
Sorry?
Formless.
Formless, right. So now the sculptor is going to use that water and that clay and start molding it into something.
Excellent. It's a perfect analogy. There's only one problem. Why not skip the first step?
What's the first step?
The first step is that God created the whole world in its potential form, which is now just an amorphous mass of potential. And now God comes in and starts organizing everything. Hold on. Yes?
But if you're going to compare the world, her God starts with clay and water. My God starts prior to that when there was nothingness.
Right.
So it's from the beginning. My God is therefore the first God and the strongest God of the world.
Okay. Okay. You guys can duke it out after class. Next. No.
When you're reading the Torah, you're trying to explain to humankind, whose God is this person? Well, this is the one that started everything, didn't need the clay and the water, went from before that.
That's correct. So now the question is, if He's creating the sculpture, and He has the ability of creating the sculpture, so then just create the finished product. Why go through the trouble of taking this mass of clay, which is formless, and forming something out of it? Yes?
And you can take this from the scientific perspective. I mean, you have all of the theories.
What's the scientific perspective?
Well, the scientific, I mean, you can take the Big Bang Theory. What is the Big Bang Theory?
That's verse 1, Big Bang Theory.
Exactly.
Right.
You have all the materials presented, everything there.
Right.
It's how you take form it that you get the evolution of creation.
Exactly. Exactly.
An anticipation that a baby being born, I mean, the anticipation of the whole developmental process.
Now, why is there a need for anticipation of the whole developmental process?
For
The developmental process is a formation. I mean, it's a evolving different...
You're going to struggle, and I don't mean to knock you down, but you're going to struggle because it's going to be circular logic. We're going to keep on coming around over and over again, and we're going to say, because it needs to be like that, because it's like that.
I'll give it to you.
You're right. And all these analogies are perfect analogies. We're left with a problem. Yes?
Okay. I think the ultimate goal is for the establishment of man, the man to use the world. So man should have an appreciation of the awesome power of Hashem, all the things that he could do to construct the world, to make man, and also to have an appreciation of, if he transgresses, that he could also deconstruct the world in the same manner that he constructed the world.
So you're suggesting that the world had to start with a state of potential, only be formed, in order for there to be a possibility of reverting the world back to unformedness.
If man doesn't conform to the laws of Hashem.
Okay, fascinating thought.
And to continue.
No, that's exactly what I'm not. Because I'm looking at the results. I'm not asking why God did that. I'm saying now that God did that, there must be something for us to learn. Because clearly we cannot question the motive of God because we have no idea. But if God presented in His Torah this verse, that means that there must be something to glean from it. That's the starting point. So we could always go back, well, why does it have to be that way? Well, why? Well, why? You're always going to get stuck because that's the way it is. Axiomatic principle, that's it. Nothing to talk about. But now that it's here, what can we derive from it? Yes? Whoa.
I think because none of us, we are not God. We do not have this omnipotence. We have to learn. We have to learn from God's actions how we control our lives.
Good.
Control what we can control by step.
That's exactly it. Yes. So now the question is, so what is it? We haven't moved an inch. I'm not, God forbid, I am not denying anyone the validity of their comments. They're all excellent comments. We've clarified the problem 10 times.
But you said, what did we learn from it? Now, in our lives, God presented us with something very good, perfect. And with all the chaos that comes about, He comes back and put it back in order. So that's what you can also learn from this too.
But what does that teach us?
That there's a potential in everything that touches us. In every situation, everything that comes up, it makes seem like chaos, but there's potential in it to do good or evil, or to do...
All right. Now we're getting somewhere.
Or to create our own world.
Okay, good. Yeah.
We do create our own world.
Maybe we have to learn the value of each thing. And even what the value of the smallest thing and the value of something that hasn't even been formed yet in its most embryonic stage.
Good. Potential is precious if actualized. Is potential valuable in and of itself? That's an interesting question to think about. But yes.
Maybe so that when we have experienced chaos in our lives, that we then approach and ask Hashem to intervene, and that He will then create for us.
Okay, perhaps. I don't know if He always kicks in as much as we would like Him to.
I'm saying that always happens, but I'm saying that
Good. Excellent thought. Good. Whoa. It's coming out. Yes.
It's a parallel or somewhat of a metaphor of things to come, because later, when we experience going together, some people will say, well, why do we have to go through all that? Why in the world do we have to find all that? trial and tribulation, why do we just deposit them on the other side? Because we had to struggle through it to appreciate what it was, and this is just laying the foundation at the beginning of the many things that are to come that's similar.
Excellent. Okay? That's the direction we're going to go in. Yes?
To me, it seems like we're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's just...
Get out. No, just kidding.
No, I mean, it's all very important, everything. But it just seems like there's just a basic understanding of a realization that he wants us to have the realization that there was chaos, that there was this point, that point, that the whole is equal to some of those points, that for us to have the understanding and the realization concretely of what's going on.
So you're suggesting that there is no real practical lesson to be learned, it's just the knowledge that that's what happened. Then I misunderstood your remarks.
I'm sorry. Okay. That I wasn't clear. We have to understand, we have to have the understanding, the realization of every single little piece. We have to realize and understand that there was chaos. We have to realize and understand all the segments.
Why?
Build up to the process.
Why?
So that we'll understand why God was there, why God did this for our benefit.
How do we see that God did it for our benefit from knowing that the world was created in chaotic form and only then was organized?
Because it gets organized.
And therefore?
For our benefit, it's going to get organized.
Okay. Again, anybody have anything to move us out of our holding pattern?
I do.
Yes.
After several weeks of us talking about this, and
Might as well stop the recording.
It almost seems to me we know what happened the first day, the second day, just from hearsay and being Bereishis and but we know how slowly this seems to be happening in our class, but we don't know how long it went on when it was nothing, when it was mumbo jumbo before this point started. So it seemed to me maybe that was like phase one, and things are still going to change, and we may be just here for phase one. But in the future, there are earthquakes, there are volcanoes, there are glaciers melting, that everything's really going to be different, and maybe there'll be a sequel to all this.
Oh, sounds like the Matrix.
I think.
I don't understand.
I didn't either.
I think that it's so that we could use the potential that we see from Hashem and organize our lives and maximize all the things around us and surroundings in order to get closer to Hashem in Olam Haba.
Okay, well said. Last comment.
So my guess is that we are created in God's image, and we are to be creators along with God. God is kind of laying out the blueprint of foundation, and He's saying, here's how the operating system works. And you start with a mush, a void, a chaos, an unformed, and you form. And you can argue whether or not the sculptor is forming or creating. You want to okay with me. In other words, you start with, you need a substance to work with. He said, this is how the thing is laid out. Start off with stuff, and you bring the stuff into being, and then you start to learn how to create shape and form, and you create stuff in the world. He's giving us a piece of that operating system, or piece of that operating manual to come understand.
Good. A lot of people have a lot of comments and a lot of responses. I'm sorry. One more. Okay. If I do one more, then it's 10 more. I'm sorry. I'd love to hear your comments. Let me just share with you. Share them with everyone else.
I think it's just like our class. We're all chaotic.
That's it. That's it. That's it. And in fact, I was happy that Susan brought up that analogy, because I think this analogy is a perfect analogy to be able to introduce this concept. And that is that God is setting up a blueprint of reality, operating system, however you'd like to phrase it. The blueprint of reality is being presented to us in this verse. This verse is not an extraneous verse, of course. Any word, any letter, every nuance of Torah has a lesson. Some of them are beyond access, but there is a lesson and there is a reason why it needs to be there. We could have very easily started with a description of day one if it was important to know what happened on day one. We start with a description of creation from nothing. That's important. And then we move into verse 2, which describes the world as chaotic, and then all of a sudden introduces the Spirit of God that somehow hovers over the water, which again is, whatever it means. But there seems to be a transition over here between a description of chaos and a transition to order. And in this verse lies a blueprint for reality. And we all know about this reality because we all experience this reality. And the reality is that the only way to achieve clarity is only if we go through a process of chaos, unclarity, confusion, what have you. Whatever you would like to fill in for that, there is a process. Failure is a precursor to success. People don't succeed right away. They fail. And failure is part of success.
And when we succeed, we shed light on the circle.
But that's verse 3. We're not there yet. The notion of confusion and then clarity is built in to everything. A seed is put in the ground. It doesn't spring forth into a flower. What does it do?
Sprout.
It decomposes. It falls apart. It becomes mush. And then it grows. A caterpillar does not turn into a butterfly. If you opened up a chrysalis or a cocoon, you will find mush. And then it turns into a beautiful butterfly. You would never in a million years think that from this is going to come that. In Judaism, the day starts at night. What a strange, pessimistic religion. Night comes before day. That's strange. I mean, I find it strange that the day begins at 12 midnight. Who decided that?
God.
No, God didn't decide that.
The monks.
Some guy decided. It's the same guy that decided that we switch the clock at 2 a.m. There are people that actually stay up till 2 just to change their clock. Don't do that next week, please. Don't do that. It sounds so arbitrary. But to say that the day begins at night sounds strange, but at least it's the beginning of something. It's either going to be at sunrise or at dawn, or it's going to be at sunset. Well, which one would it be? We would imagine that the day would come first and the night follows the day. But Judaism says no. The Torah states. We're about to find out. Next year, we'll get to the verse that says, and it was evening and it was morning.
It's symbolic of the way this happened. There was darkness.
That's correct. And I was just going to say that this class, just the process of being plunged into confusion, which I applaud my efforts in achieving that goal, and I think I managed to.
You found a good book, pick it up.
Right? We all know that if clarity is presented without undergoing the process of confusion, there really is no true clarity. We have to undergo and struggle and grapple, and we have to expose ourselves to other possibilities, hit dead ends, and only then achieve full clarity. Right? It's the same process with learning. It's the same process with growth. It's the same process with the way the day works. It's the same process with everything. And this verse is defining that template of reality.
If, for those of you who've seen Star Trek at least once, imagine if God created stuff like this in Star Trek, and all of a sudden stuff was like being in the middle of the room and just there. It would be like really hard to kind of wrap our brains around and go, what? All of a sudden there's something there. Because it's like hard to deal with. It actually makes sense for there to be a process.
Okay, perhaps. Okay, but that's the notion that's being presented here. The beginning of the world was created in a chaotic form. Could God have very simply have created an organized matter? Of course. There's nothing stopping God from doing anything. Is there a purpose in doing it that way? Absolutely. How do I know that? Because the verse presents that information to us. And therefore, we are to grapple with it and to try to understand. And therefore, this verse is telling us that the process of ultimate growth requires a prerequisite of confusion. The Talmud tells us that a person does not achieve clarity in anything until he or she stumbles on it. You have to make mistakes in life in order to achieve wisdom and intelligence. I think I saw a line once that good judgment, experience is what comes from good judgment. Good judgment comes from experience, which comes from bad judgment. I think it's a very powerful line. And we all know it's true. Now the question is, why is it true? That we can't ask. Why would God create that as a template of reality? But that's clear that it exists. And we operate from creation onwards, not what the motives were. The motive that we are told is that God is good and God wanted to present the ultimate good for mankind. That's it. Past that point, everything has to fit into that. So all struggles in life, if they're viewed in this context, wow, that really helps us try and attempt to make sense out of events in our lives and out of nature out there. That confusion begets clarity. And we can't skip the confusion step, because then we won't have true clarity. I'd like you to turn to page 148. For all you impatient people, I want to give you a taste of what the next decade will bring us.
Will we finish this for my 90th birthday?
I may. Okay, I don't know how much of this we'll be able to present, but I want to show you something which I believe is absolutely fascinating. This is God talking to Abraham. This is the Bris Bein HaBasarim, the covenant of the parts, wherein God presents to Abraham that he's developing a covenant with him and his future descendants. And Avraham Avinu is told that his descendants will be subjected to oppression, enslavement by a nation that is strange to them, and they will undergo a process of enslavement, and then they will undergo a process of liberation. They will exit the land of Egypt, and they will come to the land of Israel. They will get the Torah, etc., etc. We all know the story. So, this is where God presents to Avram Avinu, Abraham, our forefather, what his children are going to go through. Take a look at the verse. Vayomer Avram, I'm in verse 13. And God says to Avram, Yado Teda, you should know, or know for sure, Ki ger yeh zaracha, that your descendants will be foreigners, be'eretz Elohem, in a land that is not theirs. Va'avadum v'inu osam arba me'os shana. And they're going to enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. V'gam es hagoy asher yavdu dan anochi, but don't worry, the nation that will enslave them, I will judge. V'acharei chen, and only afterwards, yetzu b'rechush gadol, they will come out, they will leave with great wealth. And v'ata tavol al v'secha b'shalom, You will join your fathers in peace. In other words, you will die. Tikaver b'seva tova. You will be buried. Vidar Revi'i, next verse, in the 4th generation, Yashuvu Hena will return here to the land of Israel. Kilo Shalem Avon Ha'amori Ad Hena. The verse finishes off with almost an editorial remark just to explain why they wouldn't return until then, because the Amorites, their sin will not be complete until then. We're not going to bother describing and explaining all the details of this verse. I want to draw your attention to 2 details in this passage, if you haven't picked it up yet. There is a point of reference that is contradictory. What you talking about, Wills?
Didn't they leave in less than 400 years?
Good. That's a technical issue. We'll get there when we get to Shmos. Sorry, if we get to Shmos. There is a contradiction in point of reference. Can anybody track it down?
Talking about that they would be slaves and then you're going to leave with great wealth.
Will be foreigners in a land that's not theirs. Yes, they will be
foreigners in a...
They will be evicted from the land of Israel. They will become foreigners. Yes. Contradiction and point of reference. Yes. Where are you reading?
12.
12? We're not discussing 12. We're from 13 and on.
Verse 13 it says they will enslave them, the Egyptians will enslave the Jews, but then the next one, when they serve the Jews, the days become different people.
Okay, good point. Another contradiction and point of reference. Yes?
Is it descendants and 4th generation?
What do you mean?
It says, no, for sure, your descendants will return, that's what the 4th generation will return here.
And what's the problem?
I'm not sure they're referring to the same people that might be contradictory.
Okay, that's the beginning of, that's one of the points, yes?
It says here that afterwards they will leave with great wealth. That wealth could have been just the freedom, not material.
Could be. Again, contradiction. Let's focus. Hold on. Yes?
How can he join his father?
Okay, that's not a contradiction or point of reference. That's a good question.
I studied this, I remember it.
Verse 14. But all other nations they will serve I will judge.
Oh, I know.
Hold on. Haven't heard the ooh I know in a while. I'm sorry, what was that?
All line 14. For all other nations they will serve I will judge.
Yeah, so what's the contradiction and point of reference?
I'm not saying Abraham, the Jewish people are going to be slaves, right? So then it's going back to who's the judge? The Amorites because of their past sin?
No, he's going to judge the nation that will enslave them.
Well, he's
Sorry.
talking to Abraham. He says they will leave that nation, Egypt.
Yeah?
And you will join your father in peace.
That's
Well,
right.
he's already gone. He's already dead.
Okay. That's a good question. That's not a contradiction point of reference. Yes?
Wasn't his father an idol worshiper?
That's correct.
So why would it be good to join his father?
Good question. Again, that's not what I'm focusing at. Okay. Everyone's flying all over the place. I'm about to say, the contradictional point of reference is that in verse 13, God describes the process of enslavement 400 years. The process of redemption in verse 15, in verse 16 says,
You will be buried at a good old age.
4th generation. Enslavement is from the perspective of time. Redemption is from the perspective of people. Why? So this is not my thought. This is a thought, this is an observation that was made by the Vilna Gaon, the great scholar, and he points out that it is not arbitrary at all. In fact, the description of exile will necessarily be framed from the reference of time. And Geula, redemption, is specifically framed from the reference of people. And the reason for that is another lesson from this verse. Not this verse. We're back in verse 2. And that is that in science there's a concept called entropy. Entropy is actually a borrowed term. It's specifically said in the context of thermodynamics. But entropy basically states that the more confined an area, time will inevitably create confusion out of order. So anything that's orderly will, over time, deteriorate into disorder. If you need a proof of that, stop by my home after my kids come home, and you will have proof of that. Anything orderly becomes disorderly over time. And there's a natural disintegration in the natural world. If you walk into a home and you find dust on the furniture and cobwebs in the corner, do you assume that somebody has been living here recently or somebody has not been living here recently? This home has been abandoned for a long time. But if you walk into a home and you see everything polished and dusted and neat and clean, it's clear signs that that's right. I didn't say the carpeting was changed and the walls were painted new. But if you walk into a home and you see everything is dusted and clean and neat and organized, you know for sure that an intelligent being has been here to maintain the state of organization. It seems exactly the opposite of what I just said in this verse. What I just said in this verse was that things need to go from disorganization to organization. That's one lesson. But once things are organized, things will not be maintained in that organized state unless there's constant maintenance being applied. And that's another lesson that we learn from this verse. So when the Torah describes the process of chaos and disorder, it's always from the framework of time. When it talks about order, it's always from the framework of an intelligent being. Whether it be God, as in verse 2, or man, as it's presented in verse 17 in Lech Lecha. And therefore, we're introduced to another fundamental concept. And that is, you ready for number 3? The first 2 verses are essentially telling us 2 fundamentals of the tenets of faith of Judaism. What? The first 2 verses, which seem to be extraneous verses, because essentially we could have started our discussion with verse 3 and we would have been very happy and we would have cut out 4 classes from this course. The first 2 verses are essentially presenting us with 2 fundamental tenets of Judaism. Number 1, God created the world. That's verse 1. God created the world from nothing. Everything that exists had a beginning point, and there's an intelligent God that created everything from nothing, evidently for a purpose, because intelligent beings don't create things for no purpose. So, God created the world, verse 1. Verse 2 introduces us to a refutation of the watchmaker theory.
Oh.
Sorry. Don't take it personally. The watchmaker theory states essentially that God created the world and went to the Bahamas.
And where? It's a cruise.
And all of creation essentially took place, and it was wound up, and it's just ticking away. And verse 2 tells us that the state of the world was chaotic. And it was only the Spirit of God that now transitions the world from a chaotic mess into a state of organized clarity. And it's all the while that there's an intelligent being infusing his presence in a world that would naturally become chaotic on its own, that the world remains organized. And it's a constant state of presence of God at every moment to maintain the laws of nature as they were created. Two fundamental tenets of Judaism presented in the first 2 verses of Torah. But we can only arrive at that conclusion after we went through the chaos that we went through. Good night.
Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.